Everyone's heard of mountain warfare, but almost no one has actually understood it. Not really. Because when most people think about soldiers fighting in the mountains, they picture dramatic cliff charges and snowstorm heroics. What they don't picture is a radio operator crouched behind a boulder at 4,000 feet, frantically trying to reach a headquarters that might as well be on another planet. Not because the equipment failed, not because the enemy jammed the signal, but because the frequency his commander gave him was physically incapable of reaching that far through that terrain. And yet, that was the daily reality for the German mountain infantry in Italy. Men who were fighting a completely different war from the divisions below them. A war shaped not by tactics alone, but by physics, by terrain, by the invisible geometry of how radio waves travel through rock and ridgeline, and the decisions made about something as seemingly boring as radio frequency allocation ended up determining who lived, who died, and whether entire units could function at all. This is the story of that problem. And if you want to understand how the Second World War was actually fought, not in the headlines, but in the operational details that determined everything, stay right here. And before we go any further, if this is the kind of deep tactical history that actually gets under your skin, hit subscribe, because this channel goes exactly where most history coverage refuses to go, into the machinery of war, into the decisions that don't make the documentaries but absolutely made the difference. Now, let us go back to Italy, 1943. And we need to start not with soldiers or guns, but with a mountain. Italy is not a country that was designed to be fought over, and yet history kept using it as a battlefield anyway. The Italian peninsula is essentially a spine of mountains running the full length of the country, the Apennines cutting right through the middle, flanked by coastal corridors that narrow and widen unpredictably. In the north, the Alps create a completely different kind of terrain entirely. Massively elevated, brutally cold in winter, cut through with valleys that can channel an army or swallow it whole depending on how well that army understood what it was walking into. When the Allies landed in Sicily in July of 1943 and began fighting their way up the Italian peninsula, the Germans faced a fundamental choice. They could fall back and concede the south, or they could use the terrain to make every single kilometer of Allied advance cost more than it should. They chose the latter. And the man who understood this most clearly was Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander in Italy who looked at that Apennine spine and saw not an obstacle, but a weapon. Kesselring built a series of defensive lines across the peninsula, each one anchored to the mountains, each one forcing the Allies to either go through the high ground or find a way around it. The Gustav Line was the most famous of these. Running across Italy through Monte Cassino, it held the Allies for months, and behind it and around it, the Germans positioned some of their most specialized troops, the Gebirgstruppen, the mountain infantry. The Gebirgstruppen were not regular infantry who happened to be fighting in mountains. They were a specialized branch of the German military, with their own doctrine, their own equipment, their own culture, and critically for our story, their own communication challenges. They had been trained in the Alps. They understood high-altitude movement, cold weather survival, and the particular art of fighting along ridgelines, where the ground itself becomes your primary tactical consideration. They wore distinctive caps, carried specialized gear, and had developed over years of training a kind of institutional knowledge about mountain warfare that the standard German infantry divisions simply did not possess. And when they deployed to Italy, they brought all of that knowledge with them. But they also brought with them a communications infrastructure that had been developed in a very specific context, and that context was about to come into violent collision with the reality of Italian mountain warfare. Here is the problem, and it is a problem that most military histories simply skip over because it requires understanding some basic physics. Radio communication is not like shouting across a valley. When you shout, your voice travels through air in all directions simultaneously. A radio signal does something more complicated. Depending on its frequency, it behaves in fundamentally different ways when it encounters obstacles. Very high-frequency signals, what we today would abbreviate as VHF, travel in what engineers call line of sight. This means the signal goes in a straight line from the transmitter to the receiver, and if there is anything in between, a mountain, a ridge, a dense forest canopy, a valley wall, the signal is blocked or severely attenuated. It does not bend around obstacles. It does not follow the curvature of the earth. It goes straight, and if the straight line is interrupted, the communication fails. Lower frequency signals behave differently. High frequency signals, abbreviated HF, travel differently depending on conditions. Under certain circumstances, they can refract off the ionosphere, bouncing signals over long distances. They can also creep along the ground in what is called ground wave propagation, following the contours of the Earth over relatively short distances without needing direct line of sight. This means that in mountainous terrain, lower frequencies can sometimes maintain contact between units that have no visual line of sight to each other, while higher frequencies fail completely. This is not a minor technical footnote. This is the entire crux of the problem in Italy. Because the German divisional command structure had been built around one set of frequency assumptions, and the mountain infantry operated in terrain where those assumptions were physically impossible. Let us be precise about what we mean. When the German mountain infantry divisions in Italy needed to communicate with their parent corps or army-level headquarters, they were often dealing with distances that were not enormous on a map, but were enormous in terms of signal propagation difficulty. A headquarters sitting in a valley town at low elevation, connected to the standard German military communication network, would be operating on frequencies and with antenna configurations optimized for relatively flat European terrain. The Gebirgsjäger, the individual mountain riflemen and their immediate unit commanders, were operating at altitudes and in terrain configurations where those divisional frequencies simply could not reach them consistently. They were on the wrong side of ridgelines. They were in deep valleys that blocked signals in multiple directions simultaneously. They were at altitudes where atmospheric conditions affected propagation in ways that didn't apply to the lowland communications network. The result was a persistent and operationally dangerous communications gap between what the mountain infantry units could receive and transmit, and what the divisional command structure expected them to receive and transmit. And this gap had consequences. Real consequences. Because in mountain warfare, timing is everything. The terrain that makes mountain warfare so defensively powerful also makes coordination extraordinarily difficult. A unit on one ridge cannot see a unit on the adjacent ridge. A commander in a valley cannot observe his troops on the slopes above him. The only thing connecting these dispersed elements is communication. And if that communication fails, units begin acting independently of each other, potentially creating gaps in the defensive line, potentially duplicating efforts in one area while leaving another completely undefended, potentially triggering friendly fire incidents because two units don't know where each other is. The German army understood combined arms coordination better than almost any other military of the Second World War. Their tactical doctrine was built around the idea that infantry, artillery, engineers, and armored elements had to communicate constantly and act as a coherent whole. But in Italy, in the mountains, that coherence kept breaking down. Not because of enemy action, not because of equipment failure in the traditional sense, but because the frequencies they were using were the wrong frequencies for the terrain they were fighting in. To understand how this situation developed, you have to go back before Italy. You have to go back to the origins of German mountain infantry communications and trace the evolution of a problem that had been building for years before anyone in the Italian theater was forced to confront it directly. The Gebirgstruppen had their roots in the mountain warfare experience of the First World War. The fighting in the Alps and the Dolomites between Austrian and Italian forces had been some of the most brutal and operationally peculiar combat of the entire conflict. Units fighting at altitude discovered almost immediately that the communications methods that worked in the trenches of the Western Front did not translate to mountain warfare. Telephone wire, the primary tactical communication medium of the First World War, was extraordinarily vulnerable in mountain terrain. Rock slides could cut it, snow avalanches could bury it. The simple act of running wire up a steep slope required significant manpower and time. And a single enemy artillery shell hitting the right spot on a cliff face could cut a wire that had taken hours to lay, with no easy way to find and repair the break in time to matter. Radio offered a theoretical solution to this problem, but early radio technology was heavy, fragile, and power-hungry. Portable military radios in the First World War era were barely portable in any meaningful sense. They required large crews, considerable setup time, and power sources that were not easy to maintain in forward mountain positions. And their frequency range and power output were not optimized for mountain terrain. In fact, nothing in First World War radio technology was optimized for mountain terrain because the science of how radio waves behaved in mountainous environments was not yet well understood at the theoretical level, and certainly not at the practical military application level. The interwar period saw significant advances in military radio technology across all major powers. Radios became smaller, power sources became more efficient, frequency ranges expanded, and the theoretical understanding of radio wave propagation improved substantially. German military planners, working within the constraints of the Versailles Treaty and the intense intellectual culture of the Reichswehr and later the Wehrmacht, developed increasingly sophisticated communication doctrine. They understood, at least in principle, that different frequencies served different purposes and that terrain affected communications significantly. But the doctrine they developed was optimized primarily for the terrain and operational scenarios they expected to face most often. Blitzkrieg across the flat plains of Poland and France, armored thrusts across open ground, rapid advances where radios needed to communicate across distances that were large in absolute terms but relatively uncomplicated by terrain. Mountain warfare was a secondary consideration. The Gebirgstruppen were a relatively small part of the overall German military force structure, and their communication requirements were somewhat addressed but not fully solved by the standard communication doctrine and equipment that the Wehrmacht developed in the 1930s. When Germany rearmed and the Wehrmacht built its communication systems, it developed a series of radios designated for different echelons of command. At the squad and platoon level, there were man-portable sets designed for very short-range communication, typically using frequencies in what we today call the VHF range. At the company and battalion level, slightly larger and more capable sets were used, again primarily using VHF frequencies. At the regimental and divisional level, more powerful sets capable of longer-range communication used HF frequencies with the ability to communicate over many kilometers under normal terrain conditions. The problem with this elegant layered system was that it assumed a relatively continuous chain from the lowest tactical level to the highest operational level, with each link in the chain close enough to the adjacent links to maintain reliable communication. In mountain terrain, this assumption collapsed. A platoon on a high ridge was not just a few hundred meters from its company command post, in the sense that mattered for communications. It was potentially on the wrong side of a large rocky mass, completely blocking any line of sight VHF signal. The company commander in a valley draw was not within comfortable HF range of the battalion, because the valley itself created a shadow zone where signals from the battalion's direction were blocked by surrounding terrain. And the battalion, however well equipped, could not reliably communicate with the regiment unless both happened to be positioned on terrain that allowed at least partial line of sight or favorable propagation conditions. The chain kept breaking, and every time the chain broke, someone had to make a decision without knowing what the people above or below them in the command structure knew, wanted, or were doing. The Italian campaign forced these problems into sharp relief. The theater itself was unlike anything the Gebirgstruppen had trained for in the Alps. In the Alps, the mountains were familiar. The weather patterns were understood. The valleys and passes were known quantities. More importantly, the Alps, at least the sections where German mountain troops trained, were in Germany and Austria itself, connected to the German military logistics and communications infrastructure. There were existing installations, telephone exchanges, relay stations, and the entire technical apparatus of a modern military communication system already partially in place or easily extended. Italy offered none of that. The Apennines were not the Alps. They were lower in absolute altitude, but in many ways more complex in their tactical topography, with multiple parallel ridgelines, deep valleys, broken ground that switched from navigable to impassable within a few hundred meters, and a climate that added rainfall, fog, and mud to the altitude challenges that the mountain troops already faced. And beneath all of this, the German communication network in Italy had to be built from scratch in a combat environment while simultaneously fighting one of the most capable Allied forces ever assembled in a single theater. The communication network that the Germans established in Italy by 1943 and 1944 was a patchwork. At the Army group and Army level, there were reliable wire networks supplemented by high-frequency radio links that could reach back to Germany and forward to Corps headquarters. At the Corps level, the network was still relatively coherent, connecting major headquarters in defensible locations with good infrastructure. But as you moved down to the divisional level and below, and especially as you moved into the mountain infantry sectors, the network became increasingly fragile and increasingly improvised. The 1st Mountain Division, the 4th Mountain Division, and other Gebirgstruppen formations that served in Italy all experienced variations of the same fundamental problem. Their parent corps wanted to communicate with them on the frequencies and through the protocols that the Corps communication network was set up to use. But those frequencies and protocols did not work reliably in the terrain where the mountain infantry actually operated. The mountain infantry regiments and battalions, drawing on their specialized training and institutional knowledge, began adapting. And the most significant adaptation was frequency management. Not waiting for a top-down solution from the divisional or core level, but working out at the unit level which frequencies actually propagated reliably in specific terrain configurations and using those frequencies even when they were not the officially assigned frequencies for that echelon of command. This was not anarchic or random. The Gebirgstruppen had a tradition of unit-level initiative that was embedded in German tactical doctrine more broadly. Auftragstaktik, the doctrine of mission-type orders, gave German unit commanders the authority and the expectation that they would adapt to circumstances without waiting for detailed instructions from above. This doctrine, famous in the context of armor and infantry tactics, applied equally to communications. If the assigned frequency was not working, find one that did and report back through whatever channel remained available. But the practical result was that mountain infantry units in Italy were often operating on frequencies that their divisional headquarters did not expect, creating a second-order communication problem on top of the first. The divisional commander might have his staff monitoring the assigned frequencies, waiting for reports from his mountain infantry battalions. Those battalions might be frantically transmitting on a different frequency that actually worked in their terrain, unable to reach anyone at division because no one at division was listening on that frequency. The system was broken in two directions simultaneously. The physics prevented communication on the official frequencies, and the lack of a systematic alternative created gaps in the command picture that compounded the tactical problems the mountain infantry was already dealing with. Now, let us talk about the specific terrain features of the Italian theater that made this problem so acute. Because it is not enough to say mountains are difficult for radio communication, the specifics matter. In the central Italian Apennines, where much of the heaviest fighting of the Italian campaign occurred, the terrain is characterized by what military planners call compartmented ground. This means the landscape is divided into multiple separate compartments by ridgelines, valleys, and spurs in a way that makes lateral communication between adjacent compartments very difficult. You can sometimes see from one compartment into an adjacent valley or slope, but the line of sight is often blocked by intervening terrain features at the specific elevations where troops and their radios are actually located. The Gustav Line sector around Monte Cassino is perhaps the most famous example of this. The mountain itself, with the abbey on its summit visible for miles in every direction, was a perfect observation post, but a communications nightmare in terms of radio. Signals from the German troops defending the various slopes and approach routes around Cassino had to penetrate or circumvent a terrain that scattered, reflected, and blocked radio waves in complex and sometimes unpredictable ways. A frequency that worked perfectly when transmitting from a north-facing slope might be completely useless on the east-facing slope of the same mountain, because the ridgeline between them created a dead zone that the radio waves could not penetrate. And the mountain troops defending different sectors of this complex terrain were assigned to the same communication network with the same frequency allocations as though they were operating on flat ground with clear lines of sight to each other. They were not. Above and beyond the central Apennines, in the areas where the 1st Mountain Division operated in the more rugged terrain of the northern sectors and eventually in the Gothic Line positions, the problem intensified. The Gothic Line, which the Germans constructed across the northern Apennines to block the Allied advance into the Po Valley, incorporated some of the highest and most isolated terrain of the entire Italian campaign. Units defending Gothic Line positions were sometimes at elevations of over 1,000 meters, in terrain that was rocky, steep, and completely different in its radio propagation characteristics from anything in the divisional communication plan. The mountain troops had to communicate simultaneously in multiple directions. Downward to the valley, where artillery support elements and logistics were located, laterally to adjacent units defending neighboring sectors of the line, and upward through the command chain to battalion, regiment, and division. In each of those directions, the terrain presented different challenges, and in each case, the frequency that worked for one direction often did not work for another, forcing radio operators to constantly adjust, to use different sets for different contacts, and to develop an improvisational skill set that was not in any official training manual. The German military radio sets available to the Gebirgstruppen in Italy were a specific collection of equipment with specific capabilities and specific limitations. The Torn.Fu series of portable transceivers, the designation standing for Trägerwellen-Ortsfunk, were the workhorses of German tactical communication at the lower levels. These sets operated in frequency ranges that were adequate for relatively short-range communication in normal terrain. The Torn.Fu, D2, for instance, operated in a frequency range that would today be described as roughly in the low VHF range, suitable for line-of-sight communication over distances of several kilometers under good conditions. Under mountain conditions, those several kilometers could shrink to a few hundred meters or even less. The slightly more capable Torn.Few F, operating at higher frequencies, suffered even more severely from terrain blocking because higher VHF frequencies are even more rigidly line-of-sight dependent than lower ones. For longer-range communication between battalion and regiment, or regiment and division, the Germans used sets like the 10-watt station and later the 15-watt and 80-watt stations. These were heavier, less portable, and used frequency ranges that were more capable of handling terrain complexity, but they were also more difficult to operate in forward positions and required antenna configurations that took time to set up properly. An antenna designed to maximize the effectiveness of an HF signal requires careful orientation and specific deployment geometry. In a mountain position where troops are under fire and the available space for antenna deployment might be a narrow ledge or a shallow shell scrape in rocky ground, getting that antenna geometry right was a luxury that often could not be afforded. The antenna problem deserves more attention than it typically receives in military history. A radio transmitter without a properly configured antenna is dramatically less effective than its nominal power rating would suggest. Military radios are typically rated for their range under ideal antenna conditions. In practice, especially in mountain terrain, the antenna is often deployed suboptimally. Strung over rocks at the wrong angle, oriented away from the intended transmission direction, too close to reflective surfaces, or too short because the operator was rationing wire. Each of these compromises reduces the effective range and reliability of the radio system significantly. The Gebirgstruppen, because of their specialized training, understood antenna deployment better than average infantry. They knew that in mountain terrain, you could sometimes use the terrain itself as an antenna element, grounding the radio against a rocky surface in a way that improved its effective range in specific directions. They knew that a dipole antenna strung across a valley between two high points could sometimes overcome a line-of-sight problem that would otherwise make communication impossible. But these improvisations required time, knowledge, and the right terrain configuration. They were workarounds, not solutions. And they often conflicted with the security requirement to change position frequently, since a carefully deployed antenna configuration took time to establish and equal time to break down and reconstitute elsewhere. Signal security added another layer of complexity to the frequency problem. The German military was acutely aware that Allied signals intelligence was extremely capable. The British in particular had developed extraordinary signals interception and analysis capabilities, partly through the work at Bletchley Park and partly through the extensive signals intelligence networks that gathered raw intercepts from across the Mediterranean theater. German communication security doctrine required regular frequency changes, using schedules that theoretically prevented the Allies from monitoring any particular frequency long enough to build a comprehensive picture of German unit dispositions and intentions. The problem in mountain terrain was that these frequency changes, designed for a communication environment where there were multiple usable frequencies to choose from, often resulted in mountain infantry units switching to a frequency that was even less suitable for their terrain than the one they had been using. A schedule might call for moving from one frequency band to another at a specific time. But if the new frequency happened to be in a range that was completely blocked by the particular terrain configuration of a specific mountain position, the unit suddenly had no reliable communication at all, right at the scheduled change time. The timing was not random. The frequency change schedule was the same for everyone in the division, which meant that at the moment the schedule required all units to shift frequencies, the mountain units that had found workarounds on the old frequency lost those workarounds and had to start again on a frequency that might be worse, while the divisional headquarters continued listening on the scheduled frequency, unaware that its mountain infantry was now deaf and mute. There is a document preserved in the German military archives that survived the war, which addresses exactly this problem. It is a communication report filed by a Gebirgsjäger regiment in the Italian theater during the winter of 1943 to 1944. The report, written by the regimental signals officer, describes in clinical detail the progressive deterioration of reliable communication between the regiment's forward battalions and the regimental headquarters during a particularly difficult period of defensive operations. The signals officer notes that the frequencies assigned by the division for battalion to regiment communication provided reliable contact for fewer than 30% of transmission attempts during the period in question. He identifies the terrain between the forward battalion positions and the regimental command post as the primary factor, noting that the ridgeline separating the two effectively blocked any line-of-sight signal and that the assigned frequencies were not suitable for ground wave propagation over the distances and terrain types involved. His solution, documented with notable precision, was to establish what he called a frequency relay protocol. Forward observer posts at higher elevations, which had at least partial line of sight both to the battalion positions below them and to the regimental headquarters in the valley, were equipped with additional radio sets and given authority to rebroadcast transmissions from the battalions on a different frequency that could reach the regimental headquarters. This relay system effectively created an intermediate layer in the communication chain that had not been planned for in the standard divisional communication plan. It worked, after a fashion, but it required additional radios, additional manpower, additional power sources, and created its own problems in terms of transmission delay and signal security. The relay solution became increasingly common across German mountain infantry units in Italy as the campaign progressed and the pattern of communication failures became undeniable. But relay systems have their own vulnerabilities. The relay post, by definition, had to be in a location with good radio visibility in multiple directions. This typically meant an exposed high point, and an exposed high point was a preferred target for Allied artillery observers, who were themselves becoming increasingly skilled at identifying German communication positions through direction finding. The Allies had deployed direction-finding equipment across the Italian theater that could triangulate the location of a German transmitter based on the bearing of its signal from multiple receiver points. A relay post that was transmitting frequently, on frequencies that the Allies had identified as associated with German mountain infantry units, could be located and targeted with artillery. And destroying a relay post did not just silence one radio, it silenced every unit that depended on that relay to maintain communication with higher headquarters. The vulnerability was exponentially greater than the vulnerability of a standard communication node, because the relay was the single point of failure for multiple units simultaneously. This led to a secondary adaptation that took the frequency differentiation even further. Mountain infantry units in Italy began developing what can be described as frequency layering. Rather than using a single frequency or a scheduled set of frequencies for all communication at a given echelon, units began assigning different frequencies to different types of communication. Tactical emergency communication, the kind needed when under immediate attack and requiring immediate artillery support, used one frequency. Routine administrative and logistical communication used another. Coordination with adjacent units used a third. And communication with higher headquarters used whatever frequency actually propagated reliably for that specific terrain relationship, regardless of what the standard frequency schedule specified. This system was not officially sanctioned at the divisional or corps level. It evolved organically from the operational necessity of units that could not communicate reliably on their assigned frequencies and could not wait for the command structure to develop a solution. And it created significant problems when those units needed to be reached by the divisional command structure quickly. Because the divisional commander, or his signals officer, typically did not know which of the multiple frequencies a given mountain infantry unit was currently monitoring. Was the battalion on its standard frequency? On its emergency frequency? On the relay frequency? Listening on one and transmitting on another? The answer depended on what that battalion's signals team had worked out for their specific terrain position, and that information might not have made it back up the chain clearly enough for the divisional signals staff to track it. The artillery coordination problem was particularly acute. Mountain infantry and defensive positions in Italy depended heavily on artillery support. The terrain that made mountain positions so difficult to attack also made them difficult to supply and reinforce. If an Allied attack pressed hard enough to threaten a mountain position, the defenders often had limited options beyond calling in artillery fire to break up the assault before it succeeded. But calling in artillery fire required communication. The forward observer, who could see the approaching Allied troops, needed to communicate with an artillery fire direction center, which needed to communicate with the battery commanders, which needed to communicate with the individual gun crews. This chain of communication ran across multiple terrain features and multiple communication systems. And if any link in the chain failed, the artillery support that the mountain infantry needed in their most desperate moment was not available. The frequency mismatch between mountain infantry and divisional communications created exactly these kinds of failures at exactly these kinds of moments. An observer on a high ridge, watching an Allied company working its way up a slope toward a German position, would be transmitting on the frequency that his radio could reliably use in that terrain. The Artillery Fire Direction Center, sitting in a valley several kilometers away, might be monitoring a different frequency because that was the frequency specified in the current communication plan. The observer's calls for fire went unheard. The Allied troops reached their objective, and a position that might have been held was lost, not because of any tactical failure or any failure of courage, but because a radio signal on the wrong frequency could not get through a mountain. Let us now talk about the Allied side of this equation, because understanding the German frequency problem in Italy requires understanding what the Germans were facing and how the Allied signals intelligence operation shaped German communication behavior in ways that compounded the internal frequency difficulties. The Allied signals intelligence operation in the Mediterranean theater was extensive and highly capable. British signals units, drawing on the techniques and organizational structures developed in North Africa, had established a comprehensive system for intercepting, direction finding, and analyzing German radio traffic in Italy. The Y Service, as the British Signals Intelligence Organization was broadly known, had listening posts that covered the entire German radio communication network in Italy. They tracked frequency changes. They identified which units were using which frequencies. They correlated signal patterns with tactical events. And the intelligence picture they built from this effort was remarkably detailed. German communication security officers knew this. They knew that Allied signals intelligence was capable, and they designed their frequency change schedules and communication security protocols accordingly. But those protocols, as we have already established, were often incompatible with the terrain realities of mountain warfare. The result was a situation where German mountain infantry were caught between two pressures simultaneously. The internal operational pressure to use whatever frequency actually worked in their terrain, even if it was not the scheduled frequency, and the security pressure to stick to the scheduled frequencies and change them regularly, even if those scheduled frequencies were less effective, to prevent the Allies from establishing a reliable picture of German communication patterns. These two pressures pulled in opposite directions. Operational necessity pushed toward using stable, effective, non-standard frequencies. Security doctrine pushed toward using scheduled, changing, potentially ineffective standard frequencies, and the mountain infantry units, at the unit level, had to resolve this tension themselves, often without guidance from above, that acknowledged both pressures simultaneously. There is compelling evidence from Allied signals intelligence records, portions of which have been declassified and studied by historians, that the German mountain infantry's frequency improvisation actually created intelligence gaps for the Allies as well. Allied direction finding and monitoring networks were calibrated to track German signals on the frequencies and in the patterns that German communication doctrine specified. When German mountain infantry units deviated from those patterns, using non-standard frequencies or relay configurations, they sometimes fell below the detection threshold of Allied monitoring systems. Not by design, not because they were conducting sophisticated deception operations, but because they were simply using whatever worked in their terrain, and what worked happened to be different from what the Allied monitoring systems were primarily tracking. This was a double-edged phenomenon. The same improvisation that created command and control problems for the German division sometimes also created blind spots for Allied intelligence. An entire battalion might be operating on a frequency that the Allied Y Service was not actively monitoring, simply because that frequency was not in the standard German communication plan for that echelon. From an Allied perspective, the battalion appeared to be communicating very little, or using courier communication, when in reality, it was transmitting continuously on a frequency outside the normal monitoring spectrum. The practical intelligence consequence of this was that Allied commanders sometimes had a less complete picture of German mountain infantry dispositions than they had of lower elevation German forces whose communication was more predictable and more aligned with standard German doctrine. The logistics dimension of the frequency problem is often overlooked, but it was operationally significant. Mountain infantry units in Italy had to be supplied in conditions that were extraordinary in their difficulty. The terrain that made mountain positions tactically strong also made them physically hard to reach with food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Supply convoys had to navigate narrow mountain tracks, often under observation and sometimes under fire. Coordination between the supply elements in the valleys and the combat units on the heights required communication. And the same frequency problems that affected tactical military communication also affected logistical communication. A battalion supply officer trying to arrange an ammunition resupply had to communicate with the regimental logistics chain, which was operating in a different terrain compartment with different radio propagation characteristics. If the scheduled communication time and frequency did not produce a reliable connection, the supply request either did not get through or was delayed until the next scheduled communication window. In mountain warfare, where ammunition expenditure could be extremely high during an Allied attack and where resupply was already slow and difficult, a communication-induced delay in a supply request could leave a unit critically short of ammunition at exactly the wrong moment. The frequency problem was not just a tactical coordination issue. It was a survival issue that affected the basic ability of mountain infantry units to sustain their defensive operations over time. Medical evacuation was another dimension where the frequency problem had direct and human consequences. Mountain infantry units, engaged in some of the most physically demanding combat of the entire war, had significant casualty rates. Getting wounded men off the mountain and to medical facilities in the valley required coordination between the unit medical section, the regimental medical company, and the evacuation chains that moved casualties from the forward area to field hospitals and beyond. This coordination required communication. And the frequency problems that disrupted tactical communication also disrupted medical coordination. A unit signals officer who was using a non-standard frequency to reach the regimental command post for tactical reasons might find that the medical evacuation coordination net was on yet another frequency, one that also did not propagate well in his current terrain position. The result was sometimes that wounded men waited longer than they should have for evacuation because the signals traffic necessary to arrange that evacuation could not get through reliably. The human cost of poor radio frequency allocation is not something that shows up in operational summaries or tactical analyses. It shows up in casualty statistics and in the accounts of survivors who remembered what it meant to be cut off from the communication chain in moments of crisis. As the Italian campaign progressed through 1944 and into 1945, the German military command in Italy made several attempts to address the communication problems that had become impossible to ignore. These efforts were partly technical and partly organizational. On the technical side, there were attempts to provide mountain infantry units with radio sets that were better suited to mountain terrain propagation. This primarily meant making more low-frequency and medium-frequency sets available at the battalion and regimental level, since these frequencies offered better ground wave propagation around terrain obstacles than the higher frequencies that standard divisional communication doctrine relied on. The challenge was that lower-frequency sets typically required larger antennas for effective operation, and larger antennas were difficult to deploy in forward mountain positions. Some units experimented with folded antenna configurations that tried to achieve the electrical characteristics of a large antenna in a physically smaller deployment. These were improvements, but not solutions. On the organizational side, the mountain infantry command structure began developing more explicit relay protocols, trying to standardize what had previously been ad hoc improvisation. Specific positions were designated as relay nodes, with dedicated radio teams and specific frequency assignments that bridged between the mountain infantry frequency environment and the divisional communication network frequencies. These relay networks were better planned and more systematic than the improvised versions that had preceded them, but they still suffered from the fundamental vulnerability of relay systems in mountain terrain. They were in exposed positions. They required additional manpower and equipment. And they created complex coordination requirements that were difficult to maintain during intense combat operations. The German Gebirgstruppen in Italy also developed a practice that could be called frequency reconnaissance. When a unit moved to a new position, which in the fluid defensive fighting of the Italian campaign happened regularly, the signals team would conduct what amounted to a rapid survey of radio propagation conditions in the new position before settling on which frequencies to use for different types of communication. This was not a formal scientific survey. It was pragmatic and empirical. The radio operator would transmit briefly on several different frequencies and listen for responses from known stations, building a quick mental map of what frequencies could reach what contacts from this specific terrain position. This frequency reconnaissance became a standard part of the process of establishing a new defensive position, as routine as setting up fields of fire and clearing fields of observation. The skill of the individual radio operator and signals team in conducting this reconnaissance quickly and accurately became a significant tactical asset. A unit with an experienced signals team that could rapidly determine the optimal frequency configuration for a new position was more effective than one with a less experienced team, because the communications came up faster and more reliably after each move. This experience could not be fully documented or transferred through official doctrine. It lived in the heads of individual signals specialists who had learned through trial and error what worked in Italian mountain terrain. And when those specialists became casualties, which they did, the accumulated knowledge died with them, or was only partially transferred to replacements who had to rebuild the understanding from the beginning. The Corps and Army-level German command in Italy was not unaware of these problems. After-action reports from mountain infantry units regularly cited communication difficulties, and the divisional and corps signals officers forwarded these reports up the chain with their own analysis. But the response from higher command was constrained by several factors. The most fundamental constraint was resources: better radio equipment, more relay stations, more trained signals personnel. All of these would have helped. But in 1944, Germany was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously and facing acute shortages in all categories of military equipment and personnel. Italy was not the highest priority theater. The resources available to address communication problems in the Italian mountain terrain were limited, and they competed with the resources needed to address 100 other operational deficiencies across the entire German war effort. A second constraint was doctrinal rigidity. The German military communication doctrine, which had served extremely well in the rapid mobile operations of 1939 to 1941, was less well adapted to the static defensive warfare of Italy. Changing doctrine takes time and institutional energy, and in a command structure that was simultaneously managing crises across multiple theaters, the bandwidth for doctrinal revision and implementation in a secondary theater was limited. A third constraint was the nature of the problem itself. Communication difficulties in mountain terrain were not a new discovery. They had been known and acknowledged for decades. The solutions were also broadly known: better equipment, relay networks, frequency management. But implementing these solutions in the middle of an active campaign in difficult terrain while under sustained Allied pressure was a different matter entirely from implementing them in peacetime training. The Allied forces attacking the German mountain positions in Italy faced some of the same radio propagation challenges, but they managed them somewhat differently. The American Fifth Army and the British Eighth Army, which bore the primary burden of the Italian campaign ground fighting, had access to communication equipment that was in some ways better suited to mountain terrain than German equipment of equivalent tactical purpose. American military radios of the mid-war period, particularly the SCR series, were in some categories more flexible in their frequency range and more reliable in degraded propagation conditions than equivalent German sets. This is not a blanket statement about overall quality, but a specific observation about frequency range and adaptability. The SCR-300, the famous backpack radio that became the standard infantry radio of the American forces in Italy, operated in a frequency range that offered somewhat better performance in mountainous terrain than the Torn Fu series that German infantry units of equivalent level were using. American signals doctrine also placed somewhat more emphasis on the use of relay and retransmission stations in difficult terrain, possibly because the American military had incorporated lessons from fighting in the Pacific Theater, where jungle and island terrain created similar line-of-sight communication challenges. The Allies were not without their own communication problems in Italian mountain terrain, but the combination of better matched equipment and doctrine that was at least partially adapted to terrain-challenged environments gave them a modest advantage in the communication dimension of mountain warfare. This advantage was not decisive on its own. The Italian campaign was decided by factors far larger than radio frequency management. The relative size of the forces, the Allied control of the sea and air, the strategic situation on other fronts, all of these mattered far more than any communication-related issue. But in specific tactical situations, in specific battles for specific mountain positions, the communication advantage that Allied forces enjoyed over German mountain infantry contributed to outcomes that might otherwise have been different. The coordination of Allied artillery fire, better supported by reliable communication between forward observers and fire direction centers, was more consistent and more effective than German counter-battery fire and defensive artillery support. The ability of Allied infantry units to maintain lateral coordination across mountainous terrain, supported by communication systems that worked somewhat more reliably in that terrain, allowed more effective combined attacks that were harder for German mountain infantry to defeat in detail. These marginal advantages accumulated over months of grinding combat. And the German mountain infantry's persistent communication difficulties, including the fundamental frequency mismatch between their operational environment and their assigned communication network, were part of what made those Allied advantages possible. The Italian theater also revealed something profound about the relationship between technology and doctrine in the Second World War more broadly. The German military's reputation for tactical excellence was built on doctrine that prioritized initiative, adaptability, and decentralized decision-making. This doctrine was genuinely effective, but it was most effective when the communication systems that supported it were functional. When Auftragstaktik worked as intended, unit commanders received a clear statement of the commander's intent, and then exercised independent judgment in achieving that intent, communicating the results back up the chain, and adjusting based on information received from adjacent units and from higher command. This system required communication to work, not constant, centralized, rigid communication, but regular, reliable, bidirectional communication that kept all echelons of the command structure updated on the developing situation. When communication failed chronically, as it did in the Italian mountains due to the frequency mismatch problem, Auftragstaktik degraded in a specific way. Unit commanders still exercised initiative and independent judgment. That part of the doctrine was so deeply embedded that it continued even without communication. But they were exercising that initiative based on increasingly stale and incomplete information about what was happening on their flank.